Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. How are we doing? Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
No replies today? Okay.
Looks like you're talking into a lipstick.
It feels like it.
I know.
It really does. So weird.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll just persevere with this. So I'm going to be reading from this pamphlet called Small Inheritances. And I'll be talking about the journey just going back and forth between Southeast London and Zimbabwe, that southern connection. And the first poem is called Legalize Mary Jane. Your grandfather's imprecise smile, teeth a yellowing white, like the summer sun at high noon. You remember the lips, near black like the night on a full moon. His mornings were spent tending to his fields before greeting afternoon under the Masasa's shade, armed with an NIV Bible, old newspapers and a worn leather pouch. You fetched pieces of firewood from the kitchen so you could light what you thought to be newspaper-rolled cigarettes. You remember your grandfather's cloudy eyes, deep and grey, the sky of a storm brewing for hours. They never flickered at the first puff, but that yellow smile would spread and the smell lingered like the eye-burning smoke from wet firewood. He would hum to himself, like a man quietly praying for rain. The night he died, you had not seen him for 10 years. You sat in your mother's garden to smoke your first spliff, your brother next to you in the broken chair. You watched him hold the thin rustle of the Rizzler between forefinger and thumb, his hands like your grandfather's. The first puff made you cough till your throat burned and your eyes streamed and your brother laughed. Relax, breathe through your mouth. By third inhale, you'd found a new friend in an old smell that hung over the Southeast London night. You know what, yeah? They should legalize this shit. I read online it treats glaucoma, you know. You kept silent, looked at your brother's hands, and realized your grandfather was a healer who had puffed his way through newspaper, making the clouds in his eyes rain out the bind of no longer seeing the world in the precise light of day and night. And the next poem I'm going to read is called Dear Wind Chat. It's a bit of a long one. And kind of just looking at memory and documenting so that things are not forgotten and the beginning of fading of memories as well. I heard once the first spark of a British summer starts to rise out of the ashes of spring. You like to fly overseas, over mountains, sometimes even over the odd desert storm, over the souks of Marrakesh, over the cries of mothers in the outskirts of Kinshasa, over the march of armed barefooted boys who blend themselves into dark forests to stay alive, over the pulsing hives of ever-growing cities, over the hum of generators in case of sudden power cuts, over former colonies still scarred with leftover pain, over red dust roads and broken railways, over beaten-up paths in rolling maize fields, over the laughter of kids playing football in dusty parks, over everything which exists under the sky that covers the trail from Cairo to Cape. It has been 10 years since I left home. I have forgotten how at dusk the sun slowly sinks into the ground and the sky becomes still, ablaze. I have forgotten how the night spreads itself in the folds of a light, cold wind. I have forgotten the sound a metal pail tied to thick, long rope makes when it falls into wells swollen with a full night's rain. I have forgotten the feel of an early morning, how the eastern horizon would birth the sun till the skies spun themselves violet as a cockerel spread its wings wider than its wake-up crow. I have forgotten my grandmother's face. Both grandfathers are now dead. My first language has started to wilt on my tongue. When I speak to cousins back home, My mouth feels like it's full of the water that dead leaves flailing. I feel like home has forgotten me. I feel like home has forgotten me. I feel like home has forgotten me. Uprooted from one land to be planted in another, the cold has bitten my ears raw. My hair has started to thin at the edges. Its deep brown color shrunk to a dry ash. This cold island has defaced me, down to a rough dullness. I heard that you prefer to sun in the mornings of savannah winters, as you study the light chill of their breeze, press brown grass back into hard cracked earth. Next time, when the first spark of a British summer starts to rise out of the ashes of spring, bring me along so I can stop forgetting, so I can stop forgetting, so I can stop forgetting, so I can stop, so I can stop. The last couple of poems I'm going to read are about just being, I guess, young, Black and immigrant in this part of Southeast London that I live in. And this one is called Rye Lane, which is in the middle of Peckham. Black girls don't do drugs, said the bouncer a bussy, without searching me. Well, let me tell it. Some of us sit smug in our youth, full of white silver powders in cold smoking areas, waiting for the come-up to hit us, chase the cold that's set in our bones. We gurn on hand-rolled cigarettes, pray for the peak, our mouths dressed, tongues the taste of the foul ecstasy curdled inside our gums. We sink in this. Buzz smiles under drooped eyes, sharpened towards blue lights, which flood the wet dance floor. Our skins stay open, each touch from the base sending us in upward spirals of bright starlight. We beg the night not to end, plead with it to spend. Its morning cloaked in darkness, we want to stay alive in this wide blackness our pupils become in this ache of clenched jaws. And this last poem is about Thamesmead Estate, where I've lived pretty much most of my time living in England. It's an interesting place with interesting brutalist architecture, massive sprawling concrete place that's kind of immersed into the forest, and it feels quite detached from the rest of the city. We know this city wouldn't spit on us. Were we flagrant, red and ablaze, top deck of a bus? We learn to hear our screams walk through walls before they are cast into concrete silence. This city wouldn't even spit on us. We burn in fury and hunger, spines constricted into question marks, inside blazing tower blocks. Us, red and ablaze, top deck of a bus. We roll zoots in torn strips of Bible, spark inside lifts, burn on staircases, eyes red and ablaze, top deck of a bus. We smoke up parks and the forests too, to say screw you too. We need pretty days too, ablaze and red, top deck of a bus. London is a city of ghosts, so we hide in its shadows, overpriced acid tabs and pills. For a deep solitude, maybe prayer can break in this city that wouldn't even spit on us. Ablaze and red, top deck of a bus. Thank you.
I'm not great with microphones, so can you all hear me at the back? Great. So thank you very much, Katie, for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. Thank you, Kwame, for this incredible initiative. And thank you all for coming out on this grim evening. In fact, the biggest thing I have to thank you for was the taxi journey I had over, because I had a Farsi-speaking taxi driver, and I know just enough greetings in Farsi to make polite conversation. So he said to me, "What are you going to do in this building?" And I told him, and can you believe, he recited Farsi poetry to me the entire journey. And I just thought, I mean, really, you couldn't, it was just, so thank you all for making that happen for me. But to quote the Kenyan poet Keguro Macharia on the African Poetry Book Fund, what is most exciting is how the series has placed Africa-based and diasporic Africans in conversation by publishing them alongside each other. So as we say in Kenya, mine is to say something small. Let's start with Africa. Allow me to share a few facts I would like you to hold in your mind as we discuss. Africa, a continent with between 54 to 58 countries that, apart from the islands, all have fictitious borders. As of 3:50 a.m. this morning, 1.300741706 billion people, over 3,000 ethnic groups, 2,143 languages, not dialects, full-blown different languages. Let's think of English versus Hungarian that are spoken. Africa is home to 30% or a third of all of the world's languages. Europe, by contrast, is home to 4% of the world's languages. So I think you might see what a challenge this is to work with the concepts of Africa and African poetry. Maybe, as the poet Macharia suggests, it can only come into view when the viewer is away from Africa. Certainly, the ideas of Africa and its multiple creations is a theme which runs through the works of African poets. I think we have just heard about the poem that went from South London to Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. A theme which, like the plurality of the continent, is expressed in different ways. In my own work, which I will take the liberty of sharing with you now, I talk about the way that this plays out in what Macharia calls hyperlocal spaces and events. So this is my poem, Mistress. Nobody comes from Nairobi. She's a creation, a fiction thrown together for a railway line. Watch how in December the city empties after Jamhuri Day, the lovers deserting her to return to the patient village wife who moves like a chameleon over the years, demanding little apart from a constant acknowledgement that the city will never be home. So while we're in Nairobi, I'm going to give you just a snapshot of African poetry from the view of that city. Nairobi is a city that is saturated in poetry. When I most recently lived there, my home was literally in the middle of a school. For the first half of the year, in the run-up to the Kenya Music Festival, which takes place in August, I would hear the children reciting traditional Swahili poetry as they prepared for the competition. Traditional Swahili poetry has a strict meter to be adhered to. It sounds something like this. Na 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 na, na 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 na, na 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 na, na 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 na. I'm purposely not sharing some of the words they recite with you, and I'll return to that in a moment. These rehearsals often took place around lunchtime, and when there was a southwesterly wind, their voices would alternate with the call to prayer from the Adams Arcade Mosque. So the effect was something like this. Na 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 na, Allahu Akbar. Na 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 na, Allahu Akbar. Sometimes the rehearsals took place after school at dusk, which meant that the cicadas joined in. And I would sit on my veranda bathed in poetic sounds as the children's voices, the local mueddin, and the cicadas all called to each other. However, Kiswahili is a language that commands certain formal rhythms. It's a language designed with poetry in mind, with its double words. Sawa sawa, pole pole, sebu sebu, kumbu kumbu, boda boda. And if you ever travel by matatu, the minivans that transport people around the city, every ticket tout is a poet as they usher you in with a beba beba beba. These formal rhythms have for centuries provided a structure by which specifically Swahili people and Kenyan and Tanzanian peoples, by extension, have lived their lives. One such is the rhythm that the Swahili poet Mwana Kupona in the 19th century used to counsel her daughter on her duties and obligations to God, some say husband, in her classic poem Orutendi. It is the rhythm that the Tanzanian poet Euphrates Kalizahabi chose not to use, and instead he writes in Lugha la Kila Siku, or free verse, a decision he had to defend in a published essay to the ancestors. A defense issued even though his poetry deals with the stuff of life, which is what this rhythm is about, as illustrated in his poem Tena na Tena, the final verse of which I will read you now, first in the Kiswahili and then in the translation by Anne-Marie Drury. Wewe na mimi tutahesabu nyota hadi tutaposahau tulipofika na kuanza upya. Tena na tena, mbili milele. Salama tutatua upande wa pili. Let's you and I count the stars until we forget how far we've come and start over once more. Again and again, two forever, we'll land safely on the other side. So why am I sharing with you all this about the rhythms of African poetry? I'm hoping to highlight some of the lesser heard challenges when it comes to representing African poetry, especially on the page. A moment ago, I shared with you a rhythm that I would hear the children speaking outside my window. A rhythm that has been heard for centuries along the Swahili coast, but also further inland. I did not use words, even though the children speak them, precisely because there's a whole area of African poetry I'm not sure can even be rendered on the page. In Nairobi, I love overhearing phone conversations that have no words. Let me give you an example. I could be visiting an expressive auntie when her mobile phone rings, and her end of the conversation, which I'm listening to, will go something like this. Huh? I think you get what I mean. The final poem in this collection of Kezi Lahabi's work, Stray Truths, speaks to this, which I will share with you now. As you will hear, I do not need to translate it. The poem is called Pa. 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 What Kezi Lahabi's poem and the African Poetry Book Fund have in common is the ambitious goal to meet the challenge that is bringing African poetry to the page amidst structures that do not always match the rhythms implicit in the work. This necessarily invites important discussions, some of which I look forward to having with you this evening, and most of which will no doubt go on for quite a while to come. Erakamano, Otiomuno, Asanteni sana, merci beaucoup, thank you.
I'm just going to talk quite briefly about, I'm from Ghana originally, and my research degree was in a form of Ghanaian poetry, a historical form of Ghanaian poetry. And I just want to talk briefly about how this form of poetry has infused many different types of form and also contemporary poetry in Ghana. And how what Kwame's project and also projects that we're working on in Ghana, which are kind of in a way constituting a new kind of Pan-Africanism, a new kind of mapping of the continent, a new kind of era, I think, which we haven't quite defined yet, which is the kind of post-colonial, I guess, which is a terrible term, but for want of a better one, I'll use that now. So my great-grandfather was a divine drummer, Anodumunko Matrima, and he was also the court historian. And so he would pass on poetry, which was called Ayan, the Ayan language, in the form of drum language. My master's degree was in African art history. At the time, I was quite frustrated that I couldn't find ontologies or philosophies or poetries of the Akan. Everything was taught in kind of Western ontologies, philosophies. And so I started looking back into oral histories, oral poetries, and then came across this form of the Ayan, at the time not connecting it with my own family history. This Ayan, this form of poetry, it's kind of a corpus of poetry of which the constituent parts are interchangeable. they're told by a divine drummer, Ndumon Kumatruma. He's called the divine drummer because the boys start drumming from a very young age, and the divine drummer will set himself apart in some way with a deeper knowledge of history than the others, with kind of more proficiency in the poetry, and then will be initiated into deeper forms of knowledge than the other boys, and therefore will become the kind of leader, the lead poet. Now, the drum language, when you hear it, is... Twi my language is a tonal language. It's a two-tonal language. And so the drum somehow mimics the form of language. And yet there's some things that are told on the drum that are not told in spoken language. And so there's a male drum and a female drum. And there's different entry points into the language. For those that don't understand the drum poetry at all, it just sounds like drum beating. So the Atumpam drum leads, the Fontomfroms follow. And when you're listening to it, it just sounds like you're listening to a drum orchestra. For those who have some idea of the drum language, they might recognize popular poems like the Anyani, which is the Awakening, which is what the divine drummer plays at the beginning of every ceremony, festival, and he plays it kind of at the break of dawn, and he's calling to the ancestors, he's calling to the spirits in the drum, and calling to everybody to kind of come and be together. Now, when I started studying the Ayan and the drum language, it was quite a revelation, because not only were there histories encompassed in these poems, but also philosophies and different ways of historicizing as well. This form of telling history wasn't linear, it was cyclical, it wasn't, it was abstract, it was elliptical, it left out almost as much as it had inside it. And this is just to kind of set the tone of the kind of depth and the kind of layeredness and history that we have just in Ghana, and in the kingdoms that made up what is now Ghana before it was Ghana. In the kind of new independent era, both presidents, our president Kwame Nkrumah, with the help of traditional drummers, started to modernize what are historical drum poems, but then also new poets like Atukwe Oke, who unfortunately passed away recently, started to reimagine these forms of poetry with modern themes. A lot of the time nationalistic themes, imagining what is this new nation of Ghana through this historical form, which was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right up to the present day. I think we had a bit of a gap then in kind of our history of poetry. We had a couple of military governments. There was a curfew, which impacted on the kind of arts and creative scene in Ghana quite a lot in terms of concerts, music, poetry, etc. Everything kind of died down a little bit. What we've seen in the last decade or so is a kind of resurgence of poetry. We have a lot of young poets. We have Poetry Asantua, Nana Nyako Boateng, Nana Asase. We have a lot of poetry nights that are happening around the city. We have poetry translated into film. All kinds of different, it's a very, very vibrant scene right now. And so you see these kind of contemporary poets taking forms like the Ayan, taking liberatory, okay, I don't know how to adjective that, but different forms of like libation poetry, and modernizing it in even a different way to the way that the independence poets did. And so it's a really exciting time. Because like I said, it's a new era that we haven't quite defined yet. It's not a nation-building era that we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's something where we are drawing on the past, like the Ayan that I just described, but in a way that's also quite contemporary and sometimes even futuristic. And so this project, I think, is coming at an incredibly interesting time where, in a way, we're trying to find new ways of describing ourselves, of placing ourselves, of contextualizing ourselves in the world. I've tried to do that a little bit through this kind of ambitious Pan-African culture encyclopedia, which draws also on the Ayan in that it's elliptical and abstract and non-linear. And also this kind of collective form of poetry making, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, good. So I think I think there are a number of things I would like to sort of say that can frame a discussion, because I think what we want to have is a discussion, and it's the wonderful complexity of what happens in different African cultures and societies, where there is this remarkable modernity. Like this is a modernity that is not recent. I mean, modernity, frankly, is a kind of ultra contemporaneous world, a world that is aware of its contemporary space, and that happened in 1400 as much as it's happening now. The idea that there is an awareness of the present moment and understanding that present moment within the context of a tradition and within the context of tradition. I think what we find is we've constructed a series of literary movements and practices that have been inextricably tied to significant political movements, necessary movements, and have been part of those movements. And now we've entered a space that is trying to, I think it's true, define itself and understand itself with wonderful currents that are urgent, that are deeply pressing. Whether it is gender. I mean, the fact is the voice of women is completely, in poetry certainly, has completely changed the landscape of what we call African poetry, and then there are issues of sexuality, there are issues of migration, there are issues of the politics of the idea of family. All of these are, and then of course there's the environment and the idea of the environment and what it means. These are all sort of turning in on themselves and affecting themselves. But here's just something that just has to be said from the get-go. If there is a resurgence or if there's an explosion of poetry in Africa, it is, frankly, inextricably tied to spoken word. That is, and I use that term, I'm not saying oral poetry, I'm saying spoken word. I'm saying hip-hop, I'm saying the performance scene. It is easy for Africans to simply see that and say, well, that's ours anyway, so we just move on. But its presence and it's the ways that it has raised the attention to poetry and to thinking about poetry has actually created both a bridge and a schism, a kind of chasm, a division within our understanding of what is the new poetry, what is the new movement of poetry, and so on. And so it's impossible for me to sort of talk philosophically about the idea of African poetry without also talking in the most pragmatic ways about it, about publishing, about distribution, about performance, about festivals, about money, about fame, about all the things that are sort of built into this thing that we're calling a movement. So let me try and frame why this thing called the African Poetry Book Fund emerged, and I think it will begin to get us going on some of the key questions. These are wonderful questions that have been asked about what are we doing, what are we producing, and how does that relate to the long history of poetics and poetry in Africa over time. So the first impulse behind this work was the idea of publishing. Why? I was in the 2000s. I was sort of getting onto this international poetry circuit. It's a thing. It's these festivals all over the world, sometimes your government paid for you to go, so there's all kinds of deals that people made so that they go on these junkets. And sometimes, the poet gets some name and fame and then is invited to these festivals and so on. Whether it's in throughout Europe, the different festivals throughout Europe, or Medellin in Colombia, or the Granada Festival in Nicaragua. These festivals all over the world. There's a massive thing. Now, I began to go to these festivals for various reasons, and I noticed a trend. I noticed a pattern, and the pattern was that in the emergence of the spoken word movement, what tended to happen for African poets is that the only poets from Africa that were always on the circuit were those who were self-declared spoken word, right? Those will get on the circuit. They'll be at all of these events. Those who were not there, and also more importantly, the poets from Europe. Some were spoken word, but for the most part, these were people with books, right, and so on. And I began to observe an interesting process, a process by which the privileging of value became inextricably tied to the idea of the book. So the performance poet was there for the fun, for energy, to bring fire to the place, right? And the crowds came for that. But the serious work was focused on those people who had books. Okay. This is fine. If that's your thing, right? But what intellectually was happening was a kind of so when I got into discussions about this, the idea was we don't want to corrupt the essential Africanness, which is orality. And we want to preserve that. We want to preserve that as something that is important and so on. And so this divide along the idea of the literary versus the orality and so on and so forth was taking place. Now, remember that the entire colonial experience is built around these contradictions, right? You understand what I mean? I mean, on one hand, when we speak post-colonial or anti-colonial things, we do it in essays, right? You understand what I'm saying, right? We write major books about this kind of thing, and poets and novelists write massive epics and so on and so forth, anti-colonial epics, right? But they are written as if you're Dostoevsky, right? But there's a wrestling. There's always been a wrestling with this contradiction. Whether it is the debate between Ngugi and Wole Soyinka. Ngugi says no more English, and Achebe says English is a Nigerian language. So I mean, this thing has been going on for a long time. But there was an acceptance that there's a literary side to this experience that is revolutionary and that's transformative and so on. But what I began to see happening was a kind of quest to preserve the nativist sensibility, that preserve it so that we can go and watch it in its original form, right? Okay, so I thought this is not especially a good situation, right, as far as I'm concerned, because one, these poets would not get adopted for courses, for schools, and so on and so forth. These poets would not be written about critically, with interest in interesting ways and examine in that kind of way, because the presumption was that if you don't go and see them or buy their tapes, you can't talk about them, and and so on and so forth. So I found that there was a gap. There's beginning to be an interesting gap between the poet, the African poet, whatever their disposition, and say the African novelist. Right? The African novelists, nobody seemed to have a huge problem with them having written these books, right? Nobody was giving Ben Okri a hard time for writing, words on the page in a book. So the novel is exploding. The writers, the fiction is exploding, but what is happening is that there's this gap with the poetry. There's no attention to the poetry. Now, this would have been all well and good if I didn't know that thousands and thousands of African poets are writing, poems. They're writing poems and value the idea that the poem is spoken as well as written. They value that idea. And if I didn't know this, then I would say, well, okay, that's the situation. So for me, the question was not to define African poetry per se, but to then say, who is out there and what are they doing, and how can we support what they want to do? This is the important thing, because my view is that the poets will work it out. The poetry will work it out. The poetry will ask the question, when I write in this way, am I sort of mimicking European tradition and so on and so forth? Do I need to find something else that is truer to myself? I believe this. I believe that the poet will do that work themselves. My job then is to say, poet, I want to hear you. I want to give you a place to do that work so that you can do that great work, whatever that work is going to be, right? And I found that there was an absence of that kind of commitment to the opportunity for writers to make those choices and to make those decisions and so on. And so consequently, the idea of simply trying to work out a system that says African poets will be published was something that I felt needed some attention. It's a huge mistake to call it the African Poetry Book Fund. It remains a huge error on my part. I don't know what I was thinking then. Maybe I thought if I called it a fund, funds will come, something like that. Now people think we have money. So there's a notion that there's like a fund sitting there and so on and so forth. If you see anybody, tell them there's no money. It's not. There's no fund. It's an idea. It's like it's like if you build it, they will come. But what becomes really important in the practice, though, is that the poets will work it out. This is to me the most important factor. The poets will work it out, but the poets need not only the space to work it out, but the conversations to work it out. So I won't go too long because I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think will be worth talking about. I was in Nigeria for the Lagos Poetry Festival about 2 weeks ago, and doing a workshop, and there was an interesting conversation between Ni Osundare and a young poet, a young woman whose name I don't recall, although I think we've been in communication. But it was an interesting conversation because Ni was sort of saying there needs to be a recognition of tradition and language and history and all of these things, and he feared that many of the younger poets were not thinking about that. They were not sort of paying attention to that and so on. And this young woman then said, "But whose fault is that?" She said, which was a little explosive in the room. And she politely but gently said, "It's you, my father, my parents." And she says, I've lived and grown up in Lagos. I had to go to school to learn my language. I could function in Lagos without Yoruba. I could do my own thing. And she said, I had to go because my parents put me in private school. They didn't want me to do. She was sort of saying, and she said, so whose fault is it? What is going on in our society that is creating, you tell us that we are not holding the tradition, but you've protected us from the tradition for various reasons, right? Mm-hmm. It was a very fascinating kind of discussion. But she made the point that said, but I felt lost, and I decided that I'm going to learn this language, and then I'm going to find a way to discover my poetics in that language. It was a very interesting kind of conversation. But I think what it did was, my comment in that situation was, this is good. This moment is the moment that I'm interested in. That's the moment where the poetry, whatever poetry is going to emerge, will really emerge. And a poetry that is complicated and that is rich. Because you see, at the end of the day, all the things that, just the few things that we've talked about, looking at specific traditions of poetry that in these multiple languages that exist, and sort of discovering within those languages the sort of a poetic movement, a poetic understanding. And then through, and also in the process of multi-voiced people with multi-languages working and creating a poetics. This strikes me as hugely exciting for poetry. Those numbers are actually more exciting to think about than homogeneous voices and languages, because what it does to poetry is that what we've seen over centuries with poetry is that poetry thrives, develops, innovates, and becomes interesting when languages are at war with each other, when there's this wonderful battle for language and the creation of language in those kind of things. I grew up in Jamaica in the 1970s and so on, and what Rasta and reggae did to language, we are still being affected by it today. Do you see what I mean? And that came out of a sort of seemingly simplistic notion that you're going to subvert the dominant language. Just a simple notion. So if you said oppressor, Rasta will say, no, that don't make sense. It's a downpressor. Now, this sounds trite, but once you start building a deconstruction of a language, then you realize what is happening is that you're deconstructing the very system and the very culture, so that language then becomes the language that has to be studied, because it has transformed the language and created a new hierarchy of power and control and so on. For me, those are exciting things. But in the practical terms, putting a book together and making sure the book gets out there seems so old-fashioned and traditional. But it turns out that it's hugely necessary. It's necessary because if we don't do that, then the places where those poetries are passed on will never have access to it. This is just one of the realities of the sort of grand westernization of the world. It's just true. If there's no way for it to be accessed in certain contexts, then it can disappear. Right? It can. So this raises the importance of what I think this process is. Finally, I'll say that, but this is just one thing. Do you understand what I mean? It's one of many things that should happen. Right? You've got the handout about the digital project. The digital project is to retrieve all the things that are being lost in African poetry and in African poetics, that are being lost by time, by neglect, by lack of attention, and so on and so forth. And to retrieve them through retrieving audio recordings of traditional language, poetry, and so on and so forth, and have that available so that when the poets in this moment are deciding to make their work, they have somewhere to go to find possibilities, to find ideas, to find directions, and so on. But if we don't do that work, that stuff gets lost. That's just, a sad reality, right? And I do not hold to the Darwinian notion that, it's better because it survived. I don't buy that for a minute, right? Because in practical terms, that obviously is not a pretty notion, right? So I hope that some of the things that we can talk about are, one, the idea of language and what writing in different languages does, the idea of diaspora and migration and what that does to the poetic expression, the idea of multilinguals in a single artist and sort of the fluency of that, the idea of a kind of modernism, a kind of global sensibility that seems to be also in operation, and how the poets seem to be both in and out of that. And of course, the place of the performance and the spoken word within the idea of the poetics that emerge. All of these things strike me as fascinating and important things that we can talk about. So I will stop there, and hopefully maybe we can then sort of have a broader discussion or an extended discussion about some of the ideas that have emerged. I should say one thing about, there's an exhibition outside that is of the African Poetry Book Fund. I suggest you check it out. And when you do, there's something called a blipar. It's an app that you download. The instructions are there. It's not going to destroy your phone, don't worry. You download it and you point it to one of the pictures that is marked. You can see it. And of course, it pops up, interviews and all kinds of things on your phone that you can listen to and get greater depth in terms of some of the ideas that are there. It's frankly pretty hip, but very useful. But I encourage you to check it out because there's much more that can be said about it.